probably not with me.
For the state of Texas, and I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Julie Kutak, who Julie and I both went to London this summer to the Alzheimer's Association International Conference. It's the largest conference in the world that discusses Alzheimer's disease and brings researchers together to talk about Alzheimer's. So Julie's going to give you an update on kind of everything she learned about in London. She was very lucky to get to go and talk to so many researchers, and I get stuck in meetings all day. But she really got a great insight into all the new research happening right now. So welcome, Dr. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you. So do we want to get started now, or would you like everybody?
Because I know you're doing some background information.
Sure. Well, please feel free to get up and grab some of the delicious goodies while I'm talking. I won't be offended at all. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here for a number of reasons. I did my undergraduate degree down the road at Texas Lutheran, one of Schreiner's athletic competitors, but colleagues. And one of my colleagues in graduate school, I did my PhD at the Institute for Medical Humanities at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Krisan Muscovich, directs the Vesalius Learning and Living Institute. Is that the right?
Community, yes.
Community.
So great, thank you.
At Schreiner, and brought several of her students here. So I'm excited to see the next generation here thinking also about what a world without Alzheimer's could look like. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here from Houston, where I'm happy to say our association was spared by Harvey, and my house was spared by Harvey, and our hearts go out to all of those who are suffering the effects of it. So with that in mind, I'm here to talk about an Alzheimer's research update. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm excited. So here's what we're going to talk about today. This is a very thick presentation because I wanted to give y'all all of the juice that I could. But I want to say that there's so much research going on that I can't deliver all of it. I just can't. I don't know that anybody could. So I broke it down in a way that I hope is accessible. But if you have questions, there may be studies that you've heard about that I haven't, or studies that I've heard about that might be new to you, but we can, talk about it together. So I want to talk about the Alzheimer's Association and its relationship to research. Then we'll talk about we'll go through a timeline of major research milestones that have happened, and as we're going through that timeline, I'll give you some background information about the differences between normal, healthy aging, cognitive decline, dementia, and then Alzheimer's, which is a specific type of dementia. And then finally, I want to break down the most current research into three broad categories. Where we are in terms of understanding risk, the risk of developing Alzheimer's, the state of early detection and diagnosis, and there are things hot off the presses. Mr. Allen brought me, dropped off a piece from the Wall Street Journal that was published on Wednesday. So there's a lot of really exciting new things. So we'll talk about the state of early detection and diagnosis, and then finally what everybody really wants to hear about, which is the clinical, the pipeline for drug development and clinical trials. So that's where we're going, no surprises. Please feel free to ask me questions. I can jabber, but it's a whole lot nicer if it's conversational. So just a few brief current statistics. Alzheimer's disease is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. And there are more than 5 million Americans who are living with Alzheimer's. The numbers estimate, the statisticians estimate the numbers between 5.2 and 5.4 million Americans. And I can't really get my head around that number, but I have been to NRG Stadium, the old Reliance Stadium, during the rodeo, and that number could fill NRG Stadium 75 times. So that's a lot of people who are living with Alzheimer's. It kills more than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. And what's especially tragic is that there are generally 3 caregivers, 3 unpaid caregivers for every person living with Alzheimer's, which means there are an estimated 15 million caregivers in the United States. And as if these numbers aren't staggering enough, the costs are crippling. And by 2050, the cost could jump as high as over $1 trillion, but this year alone, the number will be in the hundreds of billions, about $259 billion. The prevalence rates are on the rise. They're on the rise in every state. The darkest states are the projected increase. You can see the darkest states, but Texas is not so light. So the numbers are growing. And truly, I believe that research is the only way that we're going to stop Alzheimer's disease. So research has to be a priority. Now, you can look at this slide in kind of a half-empty or half-full kind of way. So this slide shows that the projected, it's hard to see this, but between 20 and 2014, several different causes of death, the incidence went down. Breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, and HIV all went down, incidence. And Alzheimer's disease increased by 89%. That's devastating, but I see this slide in a different way. When we turn our attention towards a specific disease, we move the needle. And so breast cancer, prostate cancer, HIV have been a huge focus for research. Now we're starting to turn our attention towards Alzheimer's, and I believe that we can turn this slide in another direction. So I see this actually as a hopeful slide. So the Alzheimer's Association works to eliminate Alzheimer's disease through the advancement of research. That's the first part of our 3-pronged mission. Now, I did my PhD in medical humanities, and I believe that there is a lot that can be done for people even when cure isn't a possibility. And Alzheimer's disease is the only cause of death within the top 10 for which there is no means for curing or preventing or slowing the progression. And so what appealed to me about the Alzheimer's Association is also the second part of the mission, which is to provide and enhance care and support for all who are affected. So until that cure is found, the Alzheimer's Association will stand by the individuals who are living with Alzheimer's and their caregivers. And then finally, we have a public health focus, and that's to reduce the risk of dementia through the promotion of brain health. And we do that in a number of ways, including the 10 Ways to Love Your Brain campaign, and a really exciting piece of research that I'll tell you about in a minute. So am I creating a little momentum or leave you on a cliffhanger there? This is our vision. So our mission is all in service of our vision, which is a world without Alzheimer's. So we say we have a mission, we say we have a vision, and that informs everything that we do. And through that mission, in service of that mission, we have strategic priorities that work in concert with each other to help achieve our mission. So we work to increase concern and awareness. We work to advance public policy. We work to enhance care and support, accelerate research, and grow revenue so that we can support all of these other facets of the mission. We're going to go through each of these. So we advocate. We now have a 501c4 sister organization, the Alzheimer's Impact Movement. And through those efforts, in conjunction with the Alzheimer's Association, we feel like we have made a dent in moving public policy forward. Just a couple of highlights off of this slide. The Medicare Coding element of the HOPE Act just went into effect. So now the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid actually reimburse comprehensive cognitive care planning. And that includes end-of-life planning. And it's not a one-time shot. Physicians and nurse practitioners can bill this code over multiple visits. So you can have the kind of rich conversation with your healthcare provider that's necessary when you're dealing with a disease as complicated as Alzheimer's. We're working on a Palliative Care Act to improve palliative care and incorporate it more into medical school teaching. Just this year, the Texas legislature voted to expand the Silver Alert. We know that while there are 5.4 million Americans living with Alzheimer's, over 200,000 of those are under the age of 65. And before this year, Silver Alerts were only for individuals with dementia who are over the age of 65. So we advocated for that expansion of the Silver Alert, and we're very happy and thankful that that was passed. And finally,
we're new to this. What is Silver Alert?
Oh, the Silver Alert is if an individual wanders or walks and becomes lost. Okay. The signs on the road, you know, like there are the Amber Alerts when children go missing. Now there's a Silver Alert when individuals with dementia go missing. And finally, we advocate for NIH funding increase. The scientists say that it will take $2 billion a year to move us towards disease-modifying treatment by 2025. And the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee have both put forth over $400 million increase in NIH funding. So you can see that our advocacy efforts work hand in hand with our goal of accelerating research, because that funding then goes into the labs of the physicians, scientists, and physician scientists who are doing the work that will help us move towards a cure. So this is a picture from the 2017 Alzheimer's Association International Conference in London. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The Alzheimer's Association, when we talk about accelerating research, the Alzheimer's Association means what it says. We're the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research in the world. The largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's research in the world, but we're the third most impactful funder of Alzheimer's research in the world, period. After the National Institutes of Health and the Chinese government. Then is the Alzheimer's Association. What gives me goosebumps every time I say it is that what's amazing to me is that we're a donor-funded organization. And so y'all are accelerating research. Every walk, every longest day, Every fundraiser that goes on is funding the mission of the Alzheimer's Association and is moving us to real radical developments. So the Alzheimer's Association accelerates research in a number of ways, and these are just some of the examples. The AAIC, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, like Meg said, is the largest conference dedicated to Alzheimer's and dementia in the world. It's held every year for a couple of years. It's on our continent, and then it'll go somewhere else in the world. Now it's getting so big that there are satellite conferences. There's a satellite conference in Bulgaria this year. Next year, the conference is in Chicago. So if you're free in July, we'd love to see you there. The Alzheimer's Association also has the largest impact factor journal, the Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia. We have a professional organization called iStart that brings scientists together in collaboration and helps continue the conversations that happen at the conference. It continues those conversations out after the conferences are over. We support the Research Roundtable that brings together individuals and groups, both in nonprofits like us, together with the government, together with pharmaceutical companies and corporate sponsors. So what the association does is that we collaborate, we convene, and we connect. And that's, so we connect, we convene, we fund. So we don't do the research ourselves, but we help support and bring together those individuals who are doing the research. Does that make sense? So here's a picture from the AAIC. This year there were over 5,700 attendees from over 65 countries. I love this slide. I've revamped this slide for a couple of years. The first year I did this slide, it was 4,700, and then it was 5,000, and now it's 5,700. So we're on, so the word is out, and this conference is the place to be if you're doing Alzheimer's research. Here's a picture of the latest issue of the Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia. And then just to put a price tag on it, the association, like I said, donor funded, has supported $405 million in research projects to more than 2,600 programs. Now, what's exciting about the research that we fund is that it's generally more innovative than what the NIH is interested in funding. So let me go into a little bit more detail about that. So the average age of someone when they get their first NIH grant is 42. The average age of a Nobel Prize winning scientist when they made their, now not when they got the Nobel, but when they made the discovery that led to them getting the Nobel, was when they were 26. So there's a gap between the exciting research and the time when the large governmental system funds the research. So we provide smaller seed grants to high-risk, high-reward scientific programs that are going on. These programs these projects are all grant reviewed rigorously. They're peer reviewed, and they're peer reviewed by scholars who are leaders in the field. Okay, so now we get into the good stuff, how we got to where we are. And you'll see that the vast majority has really accelerated in the past 20 years. You're going to say, what was happening during all of those years that there's not anything on this timeline? And then at the end, I'll tell you there was a whole lot more that I couldn't put on there. So here's Alois Alzheimer in 1906. Here's a picture of his lab. And here's Augusta. Augusta D., who was in her early 50s and had what we now understand to be younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Now, Augusta is not the first person, of course, to ever have Alzheimer's disease. We can go back to the Greeks and see examples of it, but she's the first person to be clinically described. And she said that she was losing herself and had very large gaps in her memory. Now, this was a time of a real scientific revolution. And the exciting thing that was going on during that time is that stains were coming online. You could stain tissue cells and look at them under the microscope. This was new and it was revolutionary. So after Augusta passed away, Dr. Alzheimer looked at her brain, stained under the microscope, and found what we now call to be the clinical hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, which are beta amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So what happens in Alzheimer's disease? The plaques and the tangles are the two words to remember. The plaques are formed, let's see. I'll tell you that in a minute. I'm going to keep going through our timeline because I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So it took another 62 years for any advancements to be made. And in 1968, there was the development of the first cognitive measurement scales that were the precursors to what we now understand to be the mini mental status exam and the neuropsychological testing that goes on. 6 years later, the National Institute of Aging was formed. At this time, gerontology is starting to come online as a professional organization and professional discipline of study, the examination, the academic study of aging. In 1976, Alzheimer's is named as the most common form of dementia. And all these years later, we still give many, many community education programs where we talk about the differences, the connection between Alzheimer's and dementia. So dementia is an umbrella term. It's the category term, and it simply means the loss of cognitive functioning that's severe enough to interfere with daily life. Scientists now recognize that there are at least 48 different types of dementia. Some are conditions that mimic dementia, but are actually reversible. That's why it's incredibly important if you or a loved one is experiencing any of the warning signs of Alzheimer's, to take it seriously, but not to jump to any conclusions one way or the other. Because there are things like low thyroid, B12 deficiency, tumors, infections that can mimic the signs of dementia, but are reversible. Now, Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia. So when we say dementia, we're just talking about a category, like cancer is a category, and then you have lots of different types of cancer. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, at about 70%. Next comes vascular, and then dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal dementia. And in all honesty, I would say a good, I don't feel comfortable saying majority because I don't know what the actual numbers are, but many of the cases are actually mixed, where there will be Alzheimer's and vascular dementia at the same time, or two different types of dementia. So Alzheimer's is universally fatal. Unfortunately, it can't be reversed and it can't be cured right now. It's not a normal part of aging. And it affects more than just memory. Alzheimer's disease affects the entire brain. And as the disease moves through the brain, different aspects beyond just the idea of short-term memory or long-term memory, but balance is affected coordination, vision. The vast majority of people with the disease develop Alzheimer's after the age of 65, but there are cases of younger onset. Oftentimes these forms are more aggressive. And a very small number have inherited forms of Alzheimer's. Scientists are looking very, very closely at these families that have dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease. There's in fact a whole network where families who have this gene are being studied and helped. So when I say there's a genetic component to Alzheimer's disease, but it's only a small case of people who inherit it. I feel like I'm kind of tripping over my words, so I want to go back and explain it a little bit better. So there are different types of genes. There are genes that determine you're going to get something, like it's determined that my hair is curly, that's determined. And if you have that gene, you're determined to get it. That's the kind of inherited form that I'm talking about. And that only occurs in about 3% of the cases of Alzheimer's. The vast majority are sporadic, where there's a genetic component, but that's connected to risk genes. So you may be at a higher risk of developing it, but it doesn't guarantee it. So if I eat a hamburger every day, I'm at risk of having a heart attack because I'm eating greasy food every day. But there are always those folks who, Willard Scott talks to and says, "What's the secret to your longevity?" And the lady will say, "I ate bacon and drank whiskey every day." So they may have had some poor eating habits, but never had the heart attack. So just because you have these risk genes for Alzheimer's doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it. So what we say at the Alzheimer's Association is, unfortunately, because we don't entirely know what starts the process of Alzheimer's, is that if you have a brain, you're at risk. So does that clarify that? If you have a brain, you're at risk. Everyone is at risk of developing Alzheimer's. Okay, so 1976 is when dementia, when Alzheimer's was named as the most common form of dementia. And 4 years later, so we're only 6 years out from the National Institute of Aging being organized, the Alzheimer's Association was founded. It was founded by Jerome Stone, and here you see him with President and Mrs. Reagan. He was caring for his wife who had Alzheimer's. So it always started as a grassroots effort. Am I wrong? Oh. So it wasn't until 1984, so another between 4 and 7 years, that beta amyloid and tau were discovered rather. So beta amyloid, what has been discovered? These are the hallmarks, the plaques and the tangles. Beta amyloid is a protein that floats around inside of your brain. Every single one of us has beta amyloid inside of our brains. Something happens to beta amyloid and it gets cut by a protein called the amyloid precursor protein. This part's not on the test. But what happens is that the amyloid becomes sticky. And it starts to stick to itself and stick to itself and stick to itself and stick to itself. And it creates these clumps, these plaques that are as hard as bone. So the brain itself is the consistency of jello, and it's held in our skull. So if you imagine bone, something as hard as bone, growing through jello, the neurons, the long cells in the brain that think and form memories and help organize thoughts, can't communicate with one another. And when those cells can't communicate with one another, they die. Now, inside the brain cell, inside the neuron, is tau. And something happens to tau, it becomes hyperphosphorylated. That's not on the test either. But tau gets very heavy and it collapses. Tau is part of the microfilament system of the cell. It's part of the skeleton of the cell. So when it gets heavy and it tangles on itself, the long cell, it's like the skeleton collapses and it gets all wound up. And again, those cells can't talk to each other and they die. So beta amyloid is in between the cells, and that's one thing that disrupts cellular communication. And then tau is inside the cell and it disrupts the structure of the cells. So it's a 1-2 attack in the brain. In 1993, the first Alzheimer's drug was approved by the FDA. The last drug to be approved by the FDA for Alzheimer's was approved in 2003. So it's been 14 years since the last drug came on the market, which is why we're going to talk about that clinical pipeline. So in 1989, the Alzheimer's Association awarded a grant to develop a mouse model of a neurodegenerative disease. This is very exciting because only 6 years later, the first transgenic mouse model was approved. And in 1993, the first gene that elevates risk, not determines it, but elevates risk, was determined. Now, these mouse models are of critical importance today because the brain is so complicated that we need simplified animal models to be able to study both healthy aging and the pathology of the disease. In fact, some scientists even use fruit flies because their lifespan is much shorter, they have a brain, and you can grow them on a much larger scale. So you can look at the genetics of the fruit fly, and it actually teaches us about the human brain. So 1995, the first transgenic mouse model was announced. 8 years later, the National Alzheimer's Disease Genetics Study begins, looking at these families with dominantly inherited Alzheimer's. In 2004, the Alzheimer's Association, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative was announced at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, and Pittsburgh Compound B was reported on. Now, Pittsburgh Compound B is what is now used in not CT scans, in PET scans to image the brain. So in 1906, we were in an exciting time of scientific progress where we could look at the brain after the person died. We could look at it under the microscope. With the development of compounds like Pittsburgh Compound B, I would say we are in a new scientific revolution. Really, truly. Because now we can look at the brain in real time and start to see those plaques and tangles forming in the brain before there are any symptoms, any clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. This is hugely exciting. So in 2005, Alzheimer's and Dementia, the Journal of Alzheimer's and Dementia was launched. In 2008, ISTART, the professional interest organization, the thing that makes it the academy, you know, when you hear scholars talking about being part of the academy, it's things like ISTART that help support that. You'll see, that was only 9 years ago. And in the next years, this is where things are taking off. Okay? So in 2009, at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, a new effort to start standardizing biomarkers takes place. Biomarkers are anything from saliva to blood to cerebrospinal fluid those things that those fluids that we can take from the body and look and see if there's anything that can indicate that Alzheimer's pathology is starting to form in the body. For years and years, we still can only definitively diagnose Alzheimer's on death. But since 2009, we've gotten so much closer to being able to see it live. In 2010, Trial Match was launched. This is one of the things that I'm truly proudest of. The Alzheimer's Association has a program that's like Match.com for clinical trials. So it matches healthy volunteers and volunteers who may have Alzheimer's disease with clinical trials that they're eligible for. What is the number one barrier to scientific progress? Money. What is the second biggest barrier?
Competent research.
Participants. Study participants. People who are eligible for clinical trials don't participate in clinical trials. So Trial Match connects willing volunteers to these trials, and then they can decide if they want to take part in the trial. So you're not obligated for anything. You're just saying you're willing to get more information and learn more about it and potentially be part of the movement. Every one of these trials that's in the Trial Match database has gone through rigorous IRB and institutional review board ethics oversight and is an ethical study. So in 2011, the National Alzheimer's Plan Act, NAPA, was signed into law, and that's where Congress made a commitment to have a disease-modifying treatment by 2025. So in 2011, that was 14 years away. In 2017, we're getting closer. And so by Congress making that commitment, they're now increasing money, allocations towards the NIH. And when Congress started allocating money to the NIH, it was the first time that they had ever allocated money to one specific disease process. Rather than saying, here NIH, here's the money, y'all do with it what you see best, they were saying this money has to go towards Alzheimer's research. In 2012, the first major clinical trial for Alzheimer's prevention was initiated. In 2013, 20 new loci that could possibly increase or modulate risk for Alzheimer's were discovered. Were talked about at AAIC. So now we have the major risk genes, but they're now looking at 20 other different parts, little genetic parts. So the genetic picture of Alzheimer's is becoming much, much more complicated, and that's only been in the last 4 years. And then finally, this year, cognitive impairment care planning is now billable by Medicare. So these are just some of the milestones. But you can see it was slow in the beginning, but the major work that's been done has really gone on in the last 20 to 30 years. So the Alzheimer's Association International Conference had a lot of really interesting new studies that are going on, and I want to tell you about some of them. So now we're getting into the part where I had to break it down in order just to be able to organize it. So we're going to talk about risk, early detection, and drugs. Okay, so we've already kind of talked about this. These are these deterministic and risk genes. And so the takeaway message is that the genes that determine, people come and say, my mother had Alzheimer's, my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and they're very, very worried about it. My grandmother had Alzheimer's for 14 years. Her mother had Alzheimer's. I personally am very, very worried about it. So scientists are looking very closely. There's the DIAN-2 study, Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network Trial Unit. So this 1 to 3% of deterministic gene-developed Alzheimer's, scientists are actually looking. You may have heard of the family in Colombia, where every single family member has it, almost. Generally, people develop Alzheimer's if they have this deterministic gene when they're in their 30s or 40s. So the vast majority is sporadic, meaning we don't exactly know what causes it. And ApoE4 is the gene that we know the most about, but here are all these other susceptibility loci. Some may be protective, some may increase risk. And then we're finding out that the genes are, the little aspects, teeny tiny parts of the genes are trading places with other parts of the genes. So big data has been a real boon in helping to study complicated genetic material like this. But we know that risk isn't just related to genetics. There's a component, I'm sorry, my throat's dry. There's a component where historically underserved communities are also disproportionately bearing the burden of risk. African Americans are 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. Latinos are 1.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's than their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And so scientists are looking very closely at this to see why. And there was some new research that came out at AAIC that's starting to get at that question. Stressful events, scientists found, may increase the risk of dementia. So these were scientists out of Wisconsin, and they looked and found that one major stressful event may be the equivalent of 4 years of cognitive aging. Now, the biggest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's is age, unfortunately. And as I'm getting older every single day, there's not anything we can do about that. But there are risk factors that we can control. So 4 years of cognitive aging is very, it's significant. So they looked at the number of stressful events and correlated it to late life cognitive functioning. And no matter when they took into account education levels, when they took into account finances, even when they controlled for all of those different elements, still one by one, comparing 1 to 1, African Americans experienced at least 4 more stressful events than their white counterparts. And we find that stress is aging the brain. So this was one study, more research is needed, but what it's starting to show on a scientific level is what the anthropologists have been seeing, have been writing about for years, which is that health is affected by lots of different factors, and that there are socioeconomic determinants to health. To understand risk a little bit more, this year, the Lancet, International Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care, announced that they think that 33% of dementia cases worldwide may be preventable. Meaning that there are interventions that we can take across the lifespan to help lower the risk of dementia. And they look at 9 interventions. In early life, it's education until the age of 15. Education until the age of 15 has a protective effect. In midlife, it's exercise, obesity, and not smoking. In late life, it's things like managing hypertension, managing hearing loss. Hearing loss is correlated to an increased risk of dementia. And overcoming social isolation. among our elders. More and more, we are learning that humans are made to be in community, and that isolation is very, very harmful, particularly for our elders. So, okay, remember when I left you with a cliffhanger before? This is the exciting announcement. So, several years ago, there was a study called the Finger Study. It was in Finland. It was a geriatric study, therefore you get finger, the Finger Study. And what this study did is that it took Finnish participants, and they engaged in specific lifestyle interventions. This was a randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard of clinical trials. And scientists found the first solid evidence that it's not one thing that you can do to lower your risk. We can't change our age, we can't change our genetics, but what these scientists found is that there is a cocktail of things that you could do that led to a lower incidence of dementia. That was exercise, eating a heart healthy diet, staying socially engaged, and staying mentally engaged. Now that was really exciting research, but the population of Finland doesn't exactly look like the population of the United States. And so the concern is that the findings weren't transferable. If there was ever a time to join Trial Match, now is that time, because they are currently recruiting for the U.S. Finger Study. They're recruiting study participants between the ages of 60 and 79, and you're going to get to do all kinds of cool things, including physical exercise, nutritional counseling and modification, cognitive and social stimulation, and improved management of medical conditions. If you're selected into the clinical arm of the trial. So when we talk at the Alzheimer's Association about loving your brain, it's scientifically grounded by research studies like this that are showing that there's no way to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but there are ways to promote brain health. And the evidence is, I wouldn't say that it's there that you can reduce your risk, but it's growing stronger that it supports, that by supporting brain health, you may be able to reduce your risk. Okay, so early detection and diagnosis. So now that things like the Pittsburgh Compound B are developed, we can now see that the plaques and tangles start to form in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's 10 to 20 years before there are any clinical symptoms. This is very exciting. This is very exciting because it means that we can now target our drug development in a way that postpones the onset of clinical symptoms. So there's this great opportunity for attacking Alzheimer's when it's still in the preclinical phase. And that's where the quest for biomarkers comes in. Scientists are looking at biomarkers of fluid in the cerebrospinal fluid. They're looking at MRIs. MRIs, which are much more widely available than PET scans. I mean, you kind of have to go to a big hospital to find a PET scanner. But MRIs are much more prevalent. And there's one scientist, Dr. Eric Tanifum, who's a chemist down at Texas Children's, and he's specifically trying to develop a compound that could bind to the plaques, but that could be seen by an MRI. They're looking at CAT scans, they're looking at PET scans, they're looking at blood. They're even looking at vision changes. So One study that came out at AAIC last year was the retinal nerve fiber layer as a dementia predictor. So this had 33,000 participants, a very large study. It was observational. And they just looked at the layer, the fiber layer in the eye, and then they looked and saw who developed Alzheimer's. And when they did that, they found that the thinning of that fiber layer was connected. Can you imagine in the next few years, next 10 years, next 5 years, that you could go to your ophthalmologist for your glaucoma test, your macular degeneration test, and for the ophthalmologist to say, you also need to go talk with your neurologist. That could be a non-invasive biomarker. There is also the smell test that came out. They took about 400 people, another observational study, the average age was 80 years. They gave them this smell test where they had the participants smell different things. And then after they gave them an MRI, and then after 4 years, they looked and saw who had cognitive decline. And people who scored a lower baseline score on the smell test, it predicted cognitive decline. So more research is needed, but this could be another non-invasive way of suggesting that more tests and follow-up studies are needed. So finally, the clinical drug pipeline. There are currently no therapies that can cure Alzheimer's. What's there? Only temporarily improve symptoms in certain people for 6 to 12 months. So what these drugs do is they improve the way that the nerve cells can talk to one another. They don't talk with mouths, they talk with chemicals, and it improves the connectivity. But it doesn't stop the cells from dying. It doesn't stop the tau from forming. It doesn't stop the beta amyloid from forming. So what scientists are doing, now that we understand Alzheimer's to be a spectrum, they're looking at multiple different targets. And while I wish I could tell you this drug is, 2 years away from being on the market, I can't. But what I can tell you is that there are scientists looking at preventing Alzheimer's by looking at the genetics, like we talked about. Then this is from birth to the age of 100. Then they're looking at this preclinical stage, where they can clear out the beta amyloid before there are any clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's, thus delaying the onset. They're also looking at modifying the disease by looking at how the beta amyloid misforms. They're looking at why the cells die. They're looking at oxidative stress. They're looking at insulin resistance in the brain. And then finally, once the clinical diagnosis is made, they're looking at different drugs. They're trying to develop different drugs that can help preserve the cells that are still alive and keep those cells from dying. So it's a multi-pronged approach to looking to trying to develop drugs. But there are still needs and priorities. We still need early, accurate diagnostics. 95% of people with cancer are told their diagnosis, but only 45% of people with Alzheimer's are told their diagnosis. We need diagnostics, and we need it to be sooner in the disease process, so people have more time to plan, so they have more time to plan for their care, and so that they have longer for the drugs that are on the market to work. We need access to providers, particularly since we know that different communities and communities of color are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's. We need to make sure that all communities have access to health care. We need to standardize the biomarkers for disease progression so that any doctor across the United States knows how to diagnose Alzheimer's and knows what to look for. Of course, we need disease-modifying treatments, and we need to continue to work to streamline the drug pipeline, cut out the red tape, so that drugs that are promising make it to the market faster. I got excited and then put my clicker in my pocket because I wanted to talk with my hands. So how can you get involved? How can you be a part of the solution? The first way, like I've been saying, is to register for Trial Match. It's free. It only takes a few minutes, and they will not contact you unless you're eligible for a trial, and then you can decide if you want to participate in that trial. So you can go to alz.org/trial match, and that's the way you can that's one great way to be a part of the solution.
And we have cards in the back.
Oh, and we have cards in the back. The second is to come together with your community to raise awareness about Alzheimer's. And that's where the Walk to End Alzheimer's comes in. The walk will be Saturday, October 7th at Louise Hayes Park. It is free to start a team. It's free to register. If you raise $100, you get the best t-shirt that $100 can, the best t-shirt you'll ever earn. But, Alzheimer's is such a devastating disease that to come together in solidarity with hundreds of people who are there for the same reason is so inspiring. It's so fun. And you can see me cry, so that's always an added bonus because I'm always so touched by it every year. So I encourage you to register at alz.org/walk. And just in closing, the Alzheimer's Association meets the Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Alliance standards for accountability. It's a comprehensive, in-depth evaluation, and 78% of every dollar, 78 cents of every dollar, goes to care, support, research, awareness, and advocacy. Only 6% goes to administrative costs. So the people who work for the Alzheimer's Association are here because we believe in the importance of the mission, and we want to move the world forward. So thank you for your continued investment, your continued interest in research. Your sign that you're here today is a sign of your commitment, and I thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Clinical trials, we have found that in many cases you're not qualified if you've had chemotherapy.
Yeah.
What is the connection between chemo, radiation, cancer to Alzheimer's?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I'm sure it's complicated and beyond what I understand. I know that chemo and radiation are both therapies that work towards killing fast-growing cells, and cancer is made up of cells that don't die, right? Cells that continue to grow. Alzheimer's, on the other hand, is made up of nerve cells that are dying. And so there's got to be some kind of connection between the way, the mechanisms of cancer and the mechanisms of Alzheimer's, even if they're opposites. So what I will say is that MD Anderson in Houston has now developed a neurodegeneration consortium. It's led by Dr. Jim Ray, and they're looking specifically at the connection between cancer and Alzheimer's, and to try and learn, try and see what they can glean from the boom in cancer research. I think he said, and I'm gonna get this wrong, but I heard him say that there's been a new cancer drug that's been approved by the FDA. It's something like every 2 weeks for the past 2 years, something like that. That's not exactly right, but the rate that cancer drugs are coming online is staggering. And so what can we learn from that, and how can we translate that knowledge to Alzheimer's? So they are working on it, but the specific connection between radiation and Alzheimer's, I don't know. Yeah, yes ma'am.
Do you think there's a nutritional correlation between the high incidence of African American and Hispanic population simply due to, resources, access to medical care, but nutrition especially?
Yes, I do think so. Because some scientists are looking particularly at insulin resistance in the brain. Some even call Alzheimer's, I don't necessarily feel comfortable, sort of claiming this, but call it like a type 3 diabetes. And we know that underserved communities have less access to healthy, nutritious food, and I think that there definitely is a connection. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Have you seen on Netflix, there's a documentary on Alzheimer's, the brain, and what you're just talking about now, where there is a spray that goes up the nose
Yes.
to meet the brain, and they are saying that is exactly what you just said about diabetes, and they're calling it diabetes of the brain.
Diabetes of the brain. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And it's
No,
actually
but what's the name of that documentary?
I think it's Brain on Alzheimer's. If you go to Netflix and you put it in, it just came out in January, and the results are amazing.
Interesting.
And
I'll
they do
definitely
say
check it
that
out.
nutrition has everything to do with it.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Thank you. Yeah, what else? All right, well, yes ma'am.
I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm actually from Sante Clinical Research. We are a clinical research-based company that is here in Kerrville right now. We are working with our internal medicine physician as well. We are currently working on a clinical trial right now that is working with our Alzheimer patients. Unfortunately, this is not, of course, a treatment or a slowing of progression trial. This is actually a trial that we're looking at for patients that are wishing to be able to get back. This is a very altruistic trial. So those patients that are nearing the end of life, whether they actually have dementia, Alzheimer's, or whether they are, nearing the end of life for any other condition as well too, what we're actually being able to get to is we're at a phase 3 portion of a diagnostic dye, technically, that would be able to be used to look and see where the tau protein is actually building up. Because as you've discussed, the tau protein and the amyloid plaque are developing 15 to 20 years before we're actually showing any of those clinical signs. Again, talking about how we can incorporate this in our standard practice of medicine. If we're able to be able to have this applied within the 50s or so, then we can potentially be able to start some of this treatment to help slow down some of those. So I say that we've been very successful. It's been, of course, a very touching trial as we work with our patients because, unfortunately, as we mentioned, they are at end of life as well too. But I do have some information here if anyone is interested and if they have patients that potentially might qualify as well too. We're working very closely with all of the nursing homes, with the hospice nearby, with the Grimes Funeral Home as well too. And again, as we know, we cannot cure Alzheimer's, but we're definitely all here with the same goal in mind, and that, of course, is to be able to get to a portion of it as well. We also have a team. We have about 17 walkers with us as well too, so we're definitely involved in reaching our goal as well too and things. So I just wanted to mention that, and thank you very much for having this, this information available tonight for all of us as well.
Thank you for being here tonight.
Yes.
Great. Well, I think there's still some food, so y'all enjoy yourself, and thank y'all so much for being here tonight. Oh, and please take the evaluation and the evaluation that you filled in when you came in. Fill it out, and please turn it back in to the back table.